gathering with a message that speaks about the coalition of democracy. So I suppose we as South Africa are a very proud democracy. We've had major change. Lots more needs to be done in this country for us to be where we meant to be. I think we've got issues around unemployment. We've got inequality, divide, which is very, very wide. We've got issues around our economy, which is not very healthy right now. So how is it that we as South Africa have been invited to the G7? What's in it for them, the other world leaders or the first world countries? Philani Mthembu, good morning. Welcome to the program. And I guess you want to respond to my statements.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I think when looking at why...
Can you just speak louder or into the mouthpiece, please? We can't hear you too well.
Sorry, I hope that's...
Oh, that's great. That's great. Continue.
All right. No, I think if you look at South Africa's priorities, the current administration, a key focus is on foreign direct investment and reviving the economy, especially in a post-COVID environment. So this would explain why it would have been important for the president to actually attend the meeting. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that there were times when South Africa had not actually been invited to the G7, largely due to the domestic issues that were happening. And I think a bit of a loss of clout in terms of South Africa's role in the world. So it tells you that at least the G7 leaders are buying into, at least partly buying into the current administration's drive in terms of renewal, in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, being open to business. But it was also important for South Africa to drive home its case of a waiver or a TRIPS waiver within the World Trade Organization. And that would explain why South Africa would be invited, but also why it would have been important for South Africa to attend the meeting.
Okay.
Especially in a time where it's difficult to have bilaterals.
All right.
So to have all the G7 leaders at once, I think the president would have wanted to engage them.
What is this waiver all about? And then also let us look at, obviously in the past, I think all of those corruption cases against Zuma and the Gupta Gate scandal and everything else that was going on would have prevented us being invited. Things are radically changing. We do know that with the Zondo Commission, we're sending out very strong positive messages to the rest of the world. But let's talk about that waiver that you've alluded to. What's that all about?
Well, it's essentially about, you know, when you look at things as they stand, the production of vaccines cannot meet the global demand. There's only a few global corporations who are essentially responsible, you know, for the IP and for the production of the vaccines. And what South Africa and India have been saying very consistently throughout the pandemic is that given the fact that we are living in a pandemic, once in 100 years sort of event, we need to make an exception and share the IP, transfer technology to countries that actually have the manufacturing capacity to ramp up the production of vaccines. So what South Africa would like to see is more production sites throughout the world. They would like to see a few production sites within Africa, but also in other parts of the world, so that we are not dependent on donations for vaccines, but that we can actually produce our own vaccines and thereby increase the supply and meet the global demand.
So that was a strategic move by South Africa, obviously. Cyril Ramaphosa is now attending G7. I'm kind of also wondering then what's in it for us and what's in it for G7 in terms of relationships bilateral ties, etc., bearing in mind that China is the huge role player in Africa. They have huge investments throughout Africa, and they haven't been invited to the G7. How does that perhaps reflect on our relationship with China?
Well, I don't think it should necessarily reflect badly on our relationship with China. There's been many instances where South Africa is invited to the G7. It was highly unlikely that China would be invited to the G7. Of course, China is a member of the G20, so they'll be able to speak for themselves in
At that
the
point.
G20 summit in Italy. So it shouldn't necessarily reflect on our relationship with China, but it's very clear that South Africa wouldn't necessarily subscribe to some of the paragraphs within the communique of the G7, which are specifically targeted at China and also targeted at Russia. But I think there is something in for the G7 in inviting South Africa and other countries like India and South Korea. You must remember that in recent years, the legitimacy of the G7 has been called into question, whether these countries still wield the type of influence that they used to have in the past. And inviting members that are outside of the G7 also helps to strengthen their legitimacy. So that would have been important for the G7 to have countries like South Africa, India, and South Korea participating in some of the deliberations. But I also think, you know, when thinking about also what's in it for South Africa was definitely out there, you know, to drive home message on the waiver, but also because a huge priority for this current administration is really to attract foreign direct investment. And if you look at South Africa's economic relations, we have very strong economic relations with the countries in the G7.
There's going to be lots of behind the scenes, behind closed doors, meetings going on, and lots of deals are going to be struck. All sorts of, business deals. I'm talking at government level, high level deals will be struck. What do you see possibly happening? What more is there that we can offer as South Africa? I'm also thinking mining rights. Do you think that is one of the possibilities?
I think a big issue that would have been discussed is also the issue of energy. South Africa has obviously opened up its energy market, is allowing the private sector to play a stronger role. But also South Africa is also looking to invest more in renewable energy, solar, wind, and other forms of energy. So the energy market in South Africa, I think, is going to be highly attractive. And some of the big investors in our energy market, especially in our IPP program, are coming from the G7 countries and also some of the G20 countries. So South Africa would have wanted, I think, to show that it is open for business, that it's open for the participation of private sector in ramping up our energy production in the country. And that also falls within the broader discussion of climate change, which of course South Africa, supports quite a lot in a proactive manner, but also does call for common but differentiated treatment when it comes to the commitments of countries.
Okay, let's look closer to home. Let's look at the situation back home. Our final question, obviously. We have the issue around 32.6 or 7% unemployment. We have this inequality, a huge inequality between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. The issue around corruption, etc., etc. How do we close that gap? And what does the G7 mean as far as our domestic issues are concerned? Is there going to be a change once our president comes home, deals have been struck? Are we going to be seeing the job market opening up, more and more jobs becoming available? Because once we get that right, we're we our situation's really going to improve.
Well, I think in as far as trying to attract additional foreign investment, that's to the extent that the meetings at the G7 and some of the commitments could have an impact. For instance, there's additional funding for a just transition that will be committed by some of the G7 members, and that would provide an opportunity for South Africa. But some of our unemployment challenges are really structural. Foreign direct investment on its own will not assist us to address some of those challenges. I think South Africa needs to press ahead in terms of restructuring at home, but it also has to press ahead with regional integration and the building of regional value chains. Because unless we are integrated more within our own region than trading, more with countries in Europe and also the US, it will be very difficult to tackle some of those deep-seated and structural unemployment challenges we face in the country.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Philani Mthembu, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, giving his take on South Africa having been invited to the G7 summit happening as we speak. Just gone 9:01.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
Variant. Good morning, I'm Tabile Duma. Former South African Airways CEO Philani Mthembu says the SA